think I spent the first part of my life, in a very protected bubble, and I was ready to break those bounds. And, still learning, still was learning a lot then, still am learning a lot now. I think that never stops. And I think for me, I've just been one of those people who that passion for social change has never died in me. So that's the filter that I use when I decide what I'm going to do and how I'm going to spend my time.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Edit Undo podcast. Today we have a special guest for you. Dialogue, leadership, and a lot of the topics that I find myself exploring, reading about, and just generally interested in. So today we are speaking to somebody who is, you could say a master in this realm. Carrie actually runs a leadership course at the GIBS Business School. And so I'm really excited to get some of her insights and experiences on the topics of leadership, how that actually shows itself in the space of creativity, and lots more. And so Carrie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Amazing. So, when every time you're speaking about something that I'm passionate about or interested in, I tend to jump all over the place. But maybe before I get the chance to do that, do you maybe want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and maybe also how you sort of ended up in this space? Because I don't think anybody just starts directly in the realm of leadership and sort of that type of training. So how did you sort of get to where you are now?
So I think from a very early age, I've had a passion to make a difference in the world. So, I grew up in the United States, and I was that nerdy little kid who at Halloween went out with a trick or treat for UNICEF box instead of, the big bag for candy. I mean, I did also get some candy, but, UNICEF was part of it. And so I, started kind of on an activist journey, and that passion for changing the world has taken many different shapes, and I do many different things. But the idea for me is how do you open possibility for people? And leadership is a way of opening possibility. And for me, leadership isn't, about position or status. It's that all of us are capable of being leaders. It's about that desire to make a difference in the world. So that's I think amazing. It's a seed that was planted very early.
Sure.
And so, I mean, in terms of maybe some of the highlighted events actually leading up to, what you're doing, is this something that, you've been doing for a long time? Is it something that you sort of maybe stumbled into at some point on your professional journey?
Yeah, so I've rarely had a proper job. I, started out as an activist, and because of my work in the anti-apartheid movement, got invited to work with the ANC in exile, with an organization that was supporting the ANC in exile. And so was kind of bringing over groups of volunteers from the US to work with the ANC, with progressive publications in South Africa, independent press, and then with some progressive organizations in the frontline states. And so all of that really is about setting up learning opportunities, right? How do you help people learn? Because what we wanted is for people to come over, learn more about the struggle, and then contribute to the anti-apartheid movement back in the US. And so I think an activism really is about learning, how do you expose people to new possibilities? How do you get people to see outside of the box that they whatever box they're in, whatever bubble they're in. And so that's been the thing that's propelled me. So I've, done I do a lot of immersive learning where I take people out to have experiences. And so the leadership training is one aspect of that. But I think it's a version of what I've been doing, since I was 18.
Okay, that's amazing. I even want to maybe roll back a little bit. I actually wasn't aware of the fact that you were a part of the anti-apartheid sort of effort. I almost want to hear a little bit more about that before we get into all of the leadership and training sort of aspects of it.
How did
I almost don't even know where to start.
Go ahead. Yeah. When did you come to South Africa? Why did you choose South Africa? What drew you that you knew, you wanted to be involved in the anti-apartheid movement? What was that trigger?
So what happened was I went to university. I was kind of on a sort of the path that my parents thought I should be on for a while. And I went to university and realized I had no idea who I was. I had no idea what I wanted to study. And I knew that I was wasting resources by being there. So I dropped out. But I didn't have the courage to tell my parents. So I spent about 3 months, believe it or not, this was before email, writing and calling everyone I knew to say, does anyone have a good idea? Because once I have a plan, it will be easier for my parents to accept. And someone wrote and said, there's this amazing school in Botswana, Maruapula, and they take teacher aides. So I called my parents and I said, look, actually, I haven't been attending classes for a couple of months, but I've got this great idea, and I've got a job at a farm. I just need to come stay with you guys for a little while, work up money for my ticket, and then I'm going to go to Botswana for a year. And they said, can we call you back in 15 minutes? And I said, sure, take 20. And they went to an atlas to look up where Botswana was. And then I guess my mother said to my father, she's going to go no matter what we say, so we might as well be supportive. And so this very naive, 18-year-old went off to Botswana. And people were so kind because they didn't need to be. I really knew nothing about the world or Southern Africa. And people just took the time and had the patience to engage me in conversation, to kind of introduce me to what was happening. And I think that's where I really became interested and passionate about the struggle in South Africa, seeing what I could do in the US to be part of that. And so when I transferred to a different university. And it was a time when the anti-apartheid movement in the US was very involved in divestment. So divesting university funds from South Africa, or companies doing business with South Africa, and divesting state funds. So we, occupied the state capital. We were involved in all of those things. And because of that work, and because I met a lot of people who were representatives of the ANC in the US, when this organization Technica started working in Southern Africa, one of my friends in the ANC said, look, this organization's starting to work with us, but they don't know much about our struggle. Maybe you should send them your CV. And so I ended up in Zimbabwe for 5 years working with them.
Wow.
Met and married my ex-husband, who was in Mkhonto weSizwe. And then basically when things transitioned, we did a little jump to the US for him to study, but then came back here. And it feels like home. I can't imagine any other place I'd rather be.
Wow, that's incredible. And did you kind of know back then what you were getting yourself into?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I spent the first part of my life in a very protected bubble, and I was ready to break those bounds. And, still learning, still was learning a lot then, still am learning a lot now. I think that never stops. And I think for me, I've just been one of those people who that passion for social change has never died in me. So that's the filter that I use when I decide what I'm going to do and how I'm going to spend my time.
Sure, that's amazing, and it's not that often that we come across people who, you know, step into the space of more social responsibility and activism, and because of something that happens, they kind of lose that, like you say, the flame or fire for it, because they see it almost like a hopeless battle, because change either doesn't happen or it takes so long to happen that it can be very discouraging to continue on that path. And it's amazing to meet someone that it has not happened for you just yet, and you just sure.
Definitely.
I think you need. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask. You know, so you went to Zimbabwe and you were there for 5 years, and what was next then, when, you know, apartheid ended, and what did you do then? Where did you go, and what roles did you step in? Were you still in activism?
So we did a brief sojourn to the US. So my ex-husband, you know, had left the country with matric and said, you know, I didn't join the struggle to be a soldier. I don't want to go into the army. So applied to study at WITS and didn't get accepted. So we went to the US for a while, and he did a master's degree in urban planning and an MBA, and then we came back here.
Okay.
So my first job, but it was very brief, was with the Department of Water Affairs and Forestry, in their unit, which was working to address the backlog of water service delivery in South Africa. But you know, having never really had a proper job, I don't do well in bureaucratic structures. So I very quickly got a research contract and jumped ship. And since then, I've been working independently. And I love the flexibility that gives me to make decisions about my time and about where I put my energy.
Sure. And when did leadership become a thing? Because I know a little bit briefly about what you're currently doing from what Alfie said, but it still feels like, the journey isn't linear, and you didn't start up in leadership like Alfie mentioned in the beginning. So how did you kind of get to running a leadership program?
So GIBS, the Gordon Institute of Business Science, when it was started, the founding dean, Nick Benedel, had said, you know, it's really important that a business school has a connection to society and the broader issues of society. And so the Nexus Leadership Programme was started as really a social leadership program. So our core concern isn't, you know, kind of how do I lead in my organization, although, you know, that's part of it, but it's really how can we be the leaders South Africa needs us to be? And that's the invitation to step into that kind of leadership. So it's very linked to my activism work, because it's about how do we take on the complex challenges of South Africa, you know, the issues of inequality, the issues of, you know, poverty and gender-based violence. What is the world asking for from us in order to play a role in addressing those big issues? So for me, it's a logical pathway.
Yes, of course, yeah. It does.
Amazing.
You know, I've looked at a few leadership programs and courses and stuff, but this one definitely stands out from a more personal perspective. Like you say, it's not just about tactics and business. It's not just about being a leader in an organization in the corporate space, but it's also just more about what does a leader as a person look like? Even if that's a leader in your household or a leader in your community of friends or family, you know. So I must say that's kind of what you just described to me. It sounds like this program is not just about things you can do within an organization. You almost touch on people on a more personal level so that they don't just step out of the program as a person who can now take on a team and be a good manager and lead, but rather a more improved version of ourselves. Is that correct?
I hope so. You know, our philosophy in Nexus, or my philosophy in Nexus, is that leaders need two things, right? You need a map and a mirror. So you need to understand who you are. You need to be self-aware. You need to understand your emotional triggers. You need to understand how to manage that.
Sure.
You need to understand what your passions are, where your strengths lie. So you need to do a lot of deep introspection. But at the same time, if you don't understand the context that you're operating in, you also won't be effective. And my assessment, and it's an opinion, is that in South Africa, a lot of us live in bubbles. And those bubbles are kind of, we spend time essentially in the same places. We drive the same route to work and back if we're lucky enough to have a job. We speak to people who think roughly the same way that we do.
Yeah.
And so we begin to think that our world is the world, and it's not. It's a tiny little piece of the world. And so my philosophy is the more you expand your map and the more your map actually mirrors the terrain, the more effective you're going to be. And so we do all experiential learning. There's no lectures. There's no, texts. We go out and we engage with people and we hear their stories and we find out what's their life been like and what are their hopes and dreams and what do they think will change things in South Africa for the better. And it's in that engagement, in that dialogue with people that we learn and grow and we expand our map.
It's very interesting. When you spoke about the self-awareness part, I think that resonated with me most as a creative, because I think creatives generally end up on some type of journey of self-inquiry, because our discipline demands us to do that, right? Especially if we're trying to solve creative problems. It first starts inside doing the self-inquiry work before you actually can solve other people's problems and step into their shoes. You have to be aware of your own shoes, kind of so to say. What is the type of people that you see join this program? Because obviously it now immediately resonated with me, but I'm intrigued to hear the type of people that sign up for the program. Has that also changed over time? Because you've been doing this for a while.
People really self-select for the program. So it's really, and it's a wide and diverse range, diverse in terms of, age, in terms of position, in terms of, we get people we used to have more people from government. We don't get very many people from government anymore, but from all kinds of industries in the private sector, from civil society. We've had poets and artists and creatives. It really is something that just calls to people at a certain time, and it's always the most wonderful group.
I can imagine, because like you say, it's self-selected. So if I nominate or if I decide, I want to step into this learning, I want to do this course, everyone's quite keen to learn. They're quite open-minded and receptive to the process, because like you say, it's not a requirement. It's not that they necessarily being sent by a school or organization. They're kind of just saying, I'm in a time of my life where I now want to step into this space and learn a little bit more about this. So, I'm just thinking, as someone who's an activist, you obviously want to try and expose this to as many people as possible to get more people, like you say, self-aware, get them to become better at also just being more aware of their surroundings and get outside their bubble. But if people also just sign up for themselves, how do you feel that you contributing or trying to get people who are not willing, because those are actually the people that we want to change, right, or want to inspire change in. It's the people that aren't willing to self-reflect. What's your opinion on that?
So I believe that you can't force people to grow or learn or engage. It has to be voluntary. But that said, the tools that we work with the practices of dialogue, which is a particular methodology of communication. And I think the more you use them, the more that you do invite people to let their defenses down and engage with you. So simple things, listening to someone first and really listening for their concerns. And so my hope is that as more and more of us through the years get equipped with those skills, that we're applying them in our life with a range of people that we meet, and opening up conversations that might not be had otherwise. So I know I do that in just in my life, with people that I meet and in other roles that I take on. But my hope is really that kind of the ripples of the pond. And I also recognize, I'm one person, I can do what I can, and hopefully other people are doing what they can, and that adds up to something bigger over time.
Sure.
So Carrie, there was something that you mentioned that I'd like us just to maybe expand on it a little bit. And the place that I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about is what the program actually looks like for a person who is attending, maybe like an example of some of the activities or something of that nature. But I'd like to preface that a little bit because I sort of did a little bit of research about the program, and so one of the things that I saw mentioned in the brochure was the fact that it's not, as you sort of mentioned, it's not a bunch of lecture slides and like text that you're reading, but instead it's a participatory learning, and I think that's the term that's used. So can you maybe explain a little bit about firstly what the setup looks like, but then also why you've sort of taken this different approach to answering the questions that you've mentioned about the people taking the program?
Okay, so in terms of the setup, it changes every year. So it's one of the things I get bored very easily. I don't have sort of packages that I do over and over. So there's a kind of a trajectory, but the visits and speakers and things change depending on who's in the room and what's happening in the world at that time. But we do a combination of essentially sort of participatory workshops. So if we're looking at, for example, power and privilege, we might spend the day in class, but we're doing activities. And those activities are designed to take you a little bit out of your comfort zone, kind of as far as you're willing to stretch. And then there's always that process of reflection. So it's that action reflection cycle. You do something, it stretches you a little bit, and then you think about, okay, so what does that mean? How do I see the world differently based on that? We also leave campus and we go out on what we call immersions, where we, engage. We go and visit people and places and engage. So we might walk through a double up in Alex. We might go to Bree Street taxi rank and interview people. So the students, like at one year, we had the students marshal a taxi, and then they talked to the different people as they waited for the taxi to fill, and asked, so where are you going? Where are you coming from? How much does it cost? How long does it take you to get there? And I remember, it sounds so silly, but I remember like one of my students saying, I've been really hard on someone who works for me because they're often late. And I just didn't understand the process that they go through to get to work. And it's just, opening up those perspectives so that we see things differently. We might go to an organic farm in the inner city or, streetlight school and see how are they dealing with inclusion? What can we learn about inclusion for our own organizations and for the country based on this example? So that's kind of how we run it. And it is, I always tell students, there's no way you can catch up, right? If you're not there, you're not there. We're just about to do a day out in nature on authenticity. The idea, again, is that there's a lot of work we can do in terms of self-reflection on authenticity, but also we get to better understand ourselves and express ourselves through stillness and through movement. And so we're going to do dancing, and we're going to do a sound journey, and we're going to, so we just stretch ourselves in a variety of ways. And I think for me, so I'm also a coach, and the method I've been trained in is ontological coaching. And the theory of that is that every one of us is engaging with the world at any given moment based on our current way of being. And our way of being is, a combination of our language, which is also our internal language and our way of listening, our emotions and our physical body. So we work with all those things. What's the wisdom of the body? How can my body help relax my nervous system? How do I understand my emotions? How do I read the emotions of a team or a meeting? How could I shift that? What is the language I use? If I'm using the language all the time of should and must, if I switch that to want and choose, what happens for my way of being? So we're playing with all those things, because I don't think those changes happen at the level of way of being from the head alone.
Sure. This sounds very much like my type of thing. I'm
Join
almost
us.
a bit upset with Alfie that we only doing this now, because I just moved to Cape Town, and as you
no.
mentioned, this is not a virtual friendly immersion experience. But I think I'll definitely keep it in mind for when I come back to Joburg, to see if you have a program running and maybe how long it is and if I can somehow join, because
That would be amazing.
Yeah, all of this resonates with me so much. It's a lot of the similar practices and experimental learning I did in a few of my yoga teacher trainings as well.
Okay.
What I am interested in, and I think a lot of people are also listening and questioning, how does going into nature or doing a sound journey and dancing, how does that translate to becoming a better leader? Let's say if you are someone working in an organization or a team, how does that skill translate to you becoming a better leader? Because not everyone can really see that connection.
So it doesn't necessarily, but the idea is to invite people into activities that may or may not. So I may have never done movement as a way to engage with my own self. And so I'm going to try it out. I might hate it. I might say this is totally not for me, but I might love it. And I might say, wow, there's something in this free movement that is allowing me to kind of show up in ways that I hadn't shown up before. Then we offer people the opportunity of stillness. And what does stillness offer to you? And some people might say, hey, stillness is totally not for me. I can't, that was unbearable. And other people might say, I had this whole other realization about, myself. Yeah. And so it's just offering people opportunities to see if they can get to know themselves better in different ways. And then they might decide, okay, dancing isn't really for me, but actually when I run, I get that connection to self. So they're just offering people different possibilities, and I think particularly trying to get people to see that I think in the Western world anyway, we see our bodies as the thing that carries our brain around, right? And the brain is what's important. But there's so much wisdom in the body that we've not been taught to access or understand or engage with. And so it's also about saying, come and play a little bit be in your body, play with it, experiencing it, see what it has to offer you. Because maybe there's a whole other world that you haven't been invited into. And I think for leaders,
No, sorry, finish.
No, I think for leaders, if we're not bringing our whole selves to leadership, we're not going to be effective leaders.
Yeah. What I'm hearing through all of you just said, what stood out to me was it's almost like you're cultivating a sense of curiosity in these people. And then if I think about just reflecting on my career or my personal life and some of the leaders I can identify and what makes them good leaders, there is always that sense of curiosity, right? Because to be a good leader, you need to be curious enough to understand someone else's view and problem. So that definitely, I can see now that link, even if you didn't intentionally describe it as curiosity, it's almost like that's what I'm picking up. And then also almost encouraging you to step outside your own ego and do things that make us feel uncomfortable, trying something that's maybe not necessarily your preference. And I think that's also a very valuable skill as a leader to have, not only to understand the people you are leading, but sometimes as a leader, you have to do something that makes you uncomfortable for the better or the bigger picture and the good for the purpose that you're serving or the leadership, the direction that you're leading in, which is, quite interesting.
And the world is changing so fast, right? I mean, we've seen it recently, but the modern world moves at a pace. And so if you're a leader and you're not able to move into discomfort, it's not possible for you to lead in the modern world because
Yeah.
there's constant discomfort, right? And so learning to be more comfortable with discomfort is a key skill of leadership. And I think to your point about curiosity, it's exactly that. Because if we're not in curiosity, where are we? We're in judgment, right? We're in, I know the answer, I'm right, I know what you're going to say, I've got my answer ready, versus, wow, what an interesting way of seeing the world. How did you come to that opinion? What experiences have you had?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're trying to cultivate.
That's amazing. And so, I wanna try and maybe do a little bit of distillation here, because we've touched on a lot of different things so far. And so, one of the things I think that I picked up when I was reading a little bit about the Nexus program is that there were sort of like 3 main outcomes that you're aiming to communicate, and I think that it was self-awareness, social awareness, and a learning mindset. And when I think about it, like, I mean, the points that both you and Steph were making just now, that really encompasses those 3 aspects. But I think one of the things that maybe I'd like to focus a little bit more on is the social aspect. And there's a specific reason that I'd like to do that, and I think it applies both to the Nexus program that we've talked quite a bit about, and the Let's Talk dialogue sessions, which I think we'll maybe touch on a little bit before this is over. And the thing that I think is extremely important, and it's come up in a previous podcast that we had, is sort of creating a space for people who are in the professional environment to sort of deal with these questions outside of their work context. Because, and I'll give a very brief example. Maybe there happened to have been an incident where one person maybe said something and somebody got offended, and then there's a whole disciplinary process that has to happen in the workplace. And as a leader, that can happen to any sort of leader in an organization. And nobody's really got like a handbook or a guide of how to actually deal with something like that. But then when you think about spaces like the Let's Talk dialogue sessions and the Nexus program, what you're sort of doing is creating that environment where a professional can almost step outside of their reality and sort of learn things that typically might maybe be a little bit too costly to learn in the everyday workings. I don't know if that's something that you think about at all in the way you sort of structure the sessions and some of the questions you aim to address.
Absolutely. So we teach these practices of dialogue, which are essentially, it's a tool for having good, productive communication on all issues, but particularly around issues that are a little bit more scary to venture into. And then we have sort of a full day session, and then we have an evening session in small groups where people use those tools to have a dialogue and to engage in whatever the topic was that we were looking at. And I think, it's sad because in South Africa, we have to be able to talk about inequality. We have to be able to talk about racism and sexism and homophobia and privilege and all of these things. But many people are too scared to have those conversations. And so, and what happens I believe in a lot of kind of diversity and inclusion work is we throw people into those conversations without giving them the tools. And then they don't work very well, and people get hurt, and they get angry, and relationships disintegrate. Whereas if you have the tools, and as you say, a safe space where you can practice them for a while first, because none of us are very good at the beginning when we master something new, and a space where you've built relationships so people are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. Right? So if I don't phrase something exactly right, or if I use the wrong word, someone will gently correct me, but not cancel me. And so I think it is about, we need these spaces to engage with each other, even if it's a little bit awkwardly, to have these conversations. And I know a lot of my students, like particularly around privilege, will say, I've been so wanting to have this conversation. There's so many things I don't understand and so many questions I have, but I don't have anywhere I can go to have that conversation. So absolutely. And the Let's Talk dialogues as well. The idea is just that we don't talk to each other in South Africa outside of our bubbles. We just talk to people who think vaguely like us and have similar interests and go to similar clubs or coffee shops or whatever. But we don't talk to people who are different from us in fundamental ways and who think differently than us. And how are we ever going to reach a consensus and work together to create a more equal South Africa if we can't even talk to each other?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a few things you said there that I want to touch on, which is a lot of people probably think, yes, we do talk to each other, you know, we communicate when our paths cross or the world and our environment and socio-political climate forces us to just interact or engage, but that's just like a very small impersonal exchange, which is true. But I think when you say talk, can you also maybe elaborate on what you mean by talking to people outside our bubble?
Yeah. For me, so there's transactional relationships.
Yes.
Right? So I speak to the person in Pick and Pay and I say, can you help me find the vegan hamburgers, right? But it's transactional. I'm not finding anything out about them and they're not finding anything out about me. But what I mean is conversations where we're actually willing to show ourselves, where we're willing to be present, and not an interview where I'm extracting information from you, but a situation where I'm sharing my story as well and doing that a little bit vulnerably, you know, sort of this is who I am, this is what matters to me, these are the experiences I've had. And I think when I say talk also, I'm talking more about, or I'm meaning more sharing our experiences. Because often we share our opinions with one another, and mostly we don't change when we hear someone else's opinion. Right? We'll argue, someone might get tired, you know, but we generally don't shift our thinking.
Yeah.
But we connect when we share our stories. And that's where relationships are formed. And, you know, I mean, it sounds silly, but systems, if we're looking at what we want to do is change systems are made up of relationships, and relationships happen in conversations. So if you change the conversations, you change the relationships, you change the system. So,
that's amazing. That's powerful. So there's something else I'd wanted to touch on a little bit, and I think it was specifically in the Let's Talk dialogue session. So maybe before I sort of take the conversation in that direction, Carrie, would you mind just explaining briefly what the Let's Talk dialogue sessions are about and sort of how it's set up, just like the brief intro?
Yeah, so I started with one of my former students. I think it's about 3.5 years ago. And we just said, you know, it would be really lovely if more people could come into dialogue. So we just decided, let's see what happens. And we chose a place in the inner city to meet because we wanted a place where a diverse group of people would feel comfortable going. You know, we thought if we have it in the northern suburbs, you're going to get people from the northern suburbs, but you're not necessarily going to get a lot of other people coming. And so we said, okay, let's do it in the inner city. And we're just going to do it once a month, pick a topic and see who shows up. And it's been lovely. I mean, sometimes we have 5 people, sometimes we have 25 people. It's just kind of grown organically, word of mouth. And the idea is we choose a topic. We sit around in a circle, we check in, which is just a process of a short kind of introduction to something about you. And then we dialogue.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
To dialogue.
Dialogue, yes.
Yeah. So can I tell you a short story?
Please.
Absolutely.
You might know it already, but there's a story that's told a lot in Southeast Asia about the blind man and the elephant. And so the story goes, you know, there's a remote village in the middle of nowhere, and there's 5 blind men who live there. And they spend most of their days drinking tea on the porch and chatting about everything. And one day, there's all this excitement in the village because an elephant has come to the village for the first time. And so all the kids are screaming and laughing, and everyone's saying, oh my goodness, have you seen the elephant? And the blind men say, no, take us, because we also want to understand this. What is this thing called an elephant? And as the story goes, they're each led up to the elephant from a different side. So one is touching the side of the elephant and says, wow, an elephant is tall and flat and wide like a wall. And the one holding on to the tail says, no, I don't know what was in your tea this morning, but an elephant is much more like a small khanyani rope. And the one holding on to the trunk says, it's much more like a snake. And the one on the tusk says it's like a spear, and on and on. And as the story goes, they spend the rest of their life arguing over this thing called an elephant. And what dialogue is saying, we each bring a piece of the elephant. We're each holding on to a particular experience of the world. And if we can share those experiences, not with the idea of deciding who's right, but with the idea of trying to see this elephant emerge in the middle, we all gain. And so that's what it means to dialogue. It's about understanding, not agreement. It's about seeing if each person there can leave with a slightly expanded understanding of whatever the topic is than they had before, or a new perspective on it. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to solve. We're not trying to come up with solutions. We're not trying to see who's right or who has the best idea. We're just everyone trying to learn from with and from each other.
And so I'm glad that you mentioned it, because I wanted to maybe hone in a little bit, but specifically the check-in. And I think especially my first time sort of in the dialogue sessions, that was, I think, when I realized that there was something specifically special about starting the conversation by sharing an experience. It sort of changes the trajectory of the discussion that you're going to have. And I found it so, because it's such a small thing, but it has such a big impact, because and maybe just for a brief explanation, with a check-in, it's usually a question that you pose to the room, and each person would provide an experience that answers that. Maybe what is a challenge as a kid that you faced and eventually overcame, and then you share that story. And so when when the conversation starts from the perspective of each person having something valuable to bring to the table, the way that you evaluate and listen to people is even different, because you're no longer thinking about it as a person from outside, but as maybe a person who is going through that experience with them. And then the process of actually learning is so much easier, because it's not about whether I accept you or not, but rather it's about my perspective on the experience that you're sharing with me. And so I always found starting the conversation with a check-in such a powerful thing.
What Alfie just mentioned, and Carrie, you also said it earlier, usually when we talk to each other, it's at a very transactional level. And I've seen this, and Alfie and I both, we had a similar leader at APSA as well. And there was one key thing that he always did when he started meetings with us. And that is a human exchange, making sure that this is not transactional, this is human. And Alfie, you're right, that's also how you can bring it into business, right? It's making, first, before you start if it needs to be a transactional conversation, before you start that, making sure that every single person feels like they're being seen as a human, and we are engaging on a human level. And that personal question that just opens up that level of humanness, helps us to connect more, because then we're starting from the same level. We're all the same, we're all humans, which is such a profound tool. And like you say, it's so simple and yet so effective, because we all feel seen. And isn't that what we all... That's our humanness, right? As coming into this world, that's the one thing we want in life, is just to feel seen.
Yeah, exactly. And so often, what is the go-to when you meet someone you haven't met before? Hi, I'm so-and-so. This is what I do. What do you do? Right? So we immediately put on that mask, right? That safe thing of, I am what I do in the world. But it has nothing necessarily to do with who you are, or what you're passionate about, or what keeps you awake at night, or what big questions you're thinking about, And so it's, for me, it's about just being seen.
Sorry, Steph. I just wanted to mention something really quickly that was quite interesting, because when we started this episode, I was thinking about I need to introduce Carrie, and I was like, okay, what do I know about Carrie? And I realized, in some ways, I feel like a lot of the people at the dialogue sessions I don't know very well, because we don't speak about
Yes,
the mask.
surface level stuff. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
It's kind of like that's all the stuff that we don't speak about and all the things
Yes.
that we speak about. So I
This
feel like I
job.
know you really well, but then when I actually have to put it into words, I'm like, why is this difficult? And it's actually a great place to be,
So
because I
interesting.
think everybody always has so much to share and just doesn't find the right context or the right situation to be able to exchange experiences without the usual, judgment and criticism that comes from sharing maybe a personal experience in a less than friendly audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think it's amazing to be able to know people at that deep level, but maybe not necessarily as well at the level of the persona.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're actually also saying, Alpheus, I think we all have this illusion that in relationships, whether it's work or personal, in order to build a trusting relationship, it takes years. And it takes a lot of exchange of words, where what you're just saying, it's not necessarily the quantity of words and verbal exchange, but it's more strategic, right? It's a what are you sharing? What is that conversation that you're having? So trust isn't about the time. It's more about the how or the why.
Yeah. Jared, who runs the dialogues with me, says what he does when he meets new people, like in a work context, or he says, look, can we have a 30-minute sit down? And he says, in 10 minutes, I'm going to share my story, my life story. In 10 minutes, I'd love to hear yours. And then for the last 10 minutes, we can just chat about what came up. And he says, it just right there in 30 minutes, you've established a different kind of relationship that you might not establish in 20 years of working together.
Yeah, sure.
And it's funny how, especially with people who typically seem out of reach, it's funny how that kind of an approach levels the playing field really quickly.
Yeah.
Like if you just approach someone as a human being and have a discussion about them, like, who are you as an individual? What's your family like? How is like, who are you? And you sort of deal with them instead of coming up and being like, hi, Mr. CEO, how is it being a CEO? And when you sort of bring the conversation down to that level, people almost feel more comfortable meeting you there, rather than having to, like, either speak up or down to you. And I think there's something useful about that sort of equivalent reaching out when it comes to a conversation. And it's something that I think that has helped me as well, also professionally. I remember when I first started the job I'm working now, that actually was one of the things that I did. I sort of set up a session with each person in my team, and then also each person like above me as well, and just had like a 30-minute virtual coffee, and sort of get to know them, get to know a little bit about their family, what they want, what they're hoping to achieve in the medium to near future. And that just it sets the tone for future conversations, and it sort of starts the road at the perspective of, first of all, you're a human, and then your many other things. And I've found that it's been consistently effective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do want to get some practicality out of you, especially for myself and for other people listening. To hear, as someone who teaches and facilitates good dialogue and communication, firstly, what is a good communicator? What are those traits? And for anyone listening, including us, how and what things can we do to become better communicators?
So if I on one level, one way to answer that is just to introduce you briefly to the practices of dialogue, because they sound very simple, but they definitely take a lifetime of practice. But there's 4 practices of dialogue that even if you're not in a formal dialogue with someone, are really useful tools for better communication. And the first is listening. And I think, again, all of these terms, we have an idea in our head already. I know what listening is. But in the context of dialogue, listening is stilling all that inner noise. So it's all the things that prevent you from really hearing. So, it's the judgments in your head, like, I can't believe they said that. Or, I wonder if my partner picked up the kids from daycare, or what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Or did I manage to send that email? Whatever it is, all that noise. It's about stilling that noise so that you can really listen. And then the second one is about suspending. And when we say suspending in the context of dialogue, people think of suspending judgment, but what judgment is a profound sense that you're right about something. So suspending is really about letting go of your need to be right. And most of us, from our schools, from our families, from the jobs that we've had, have this deeply ingrained desire to be right, because that's how we get approval, right? So who knows the answer? I do. Well done, you get a gold star, right? So having the answer has become very important in our society. But when we think we have the answer, we're not open to anything else. So, it's about saying, okay, I might have part of the answer, but can I open to the fact that maybe there's 10% more I can learn? So it's, stilling the inner noise. It's letting go of that need to be right about things. Then the third one is respecting, which is, again, people have different meanings, but in the context of dialogue, it's about a genuine belief that everyone has something to teach you. And it's your job to figure out what it is. Because if you don't really believe someone has something to teach you, you're not listening and you're not suspending. And then the final one is voicing. And voicing isn't just about speaking. It's about sharing your perspective of the elephant at a time and in a way that it's most likely to be heard by other people. So, sometimes people say, no, I'm voicing, but what I'm doing is I'm throwing grenades, like, well, this is what I think, but it's not in a way that it's going to be heard. It's not at a time that it's going to be heard. It's all it's going to do is create an explosion. And so voicing is really that art. And I think it is an art of really figuring out, how do I speak to someone else's listening? Is this the right time? Is what I want to say just because I want to hear myself speak, or because I want to be acknowledged? Or am I really adding something new to whatever we're talking about? And so it's playing with that combination of tools, which are all interrelated. And I think if you work on those, it will improve your communication thousandfold. I mean, for me, those tools are the best parenting skills, for example, that I ever had. It just transformed my relationship with my children. So I think that's it. They're simple tools, but not necessarily easy. And then the other point, which you mentioned earlier, Stephanie, is about the emotional regulation. So, can I get to understand in my body when my nervous system has been triggered, because in that state, I'm not going to have good communication. And can I work with my body and my breath to bring my nervous system back into regulation so that I can engage in a more meaningful way? Because I think that's the other thing that trips up our conversation a lot, is we get emotionally triggered.
Absolutely.
And then the grenades start coming again. So I don't know if that's helpful.
That is, for sure,
But I think those are very important tools. There's also a book called Nonviolent Communication, which is brilliant. Can't remember the author, but I think it's Rosenberg.
Okay, cool.
And that's a brilliant book if anyone really wants to do a deep dive into productive communication.
Yeah. So there's one, I think, other tool that I want to mention a little bit about, because I have to admit that I think you're one of the people who practices it the best, and that's sort of like sitting in silence. It's one of the things that I really struggled with when I first joined, because every time there's a bit of a silence, especially when you're not used to it, you sort of get the urge to just fill the silence with your voice, especially for the more talkative types like myself. And so, being able to just maybe put out a comment and then just wait. Because, when we're speaking to people and we're not really conscious about it, we sometimes think that, we think about what we want to say, we say it, and the other person immediately replies without any sort of mental processes going on. But each person, when they're in dialogue, is going through like an ongoing, essentially struggle with their fears and their challenges and the memories and experiences that they've lived up until that point. And so sometimes you do just need to be able to sit in the silence to let a person maybe overcome the inner doubts and the voice that's maybe getting in their way, so that they can actually be able to share whatever experience it is. And I find that it's after you get through your first few silences that people actually really start to break through. And at least that's what I've experienced. And it's awkward when it's happening, but the funny thing is when you sort of see somebody else doing it, in some ways it feels natural, because I mean, if you're really answering about what you think and you're really telling the truth about it, you do need to be able to stop and think. You do need to be able to evaluate your thoughts and sort of put your words together. And so I think being able to just be silent and be comfortable there, I think is so important and difficult. Yeah. So I think we might probably be stepping into the final stages of this discussion, and it really has been great so far. But maybe, Carrie, what would you maybe say as either a parting piece of advice or lesson that you've learned, but specifically about communication, that you'd maybe like to leave both us and our audience with?
Sorry, silence doesn't do well on a podcast, I guess.
We can make it work.
I think for me, and I'll just tell you a story a little bit vulnerably. So when you asked me, Alfie, to be on the podcast, and I said yes, because I adore you. And then I kind of did some more looking into the podcast. I thought, I'm not sure I'm the right person to be on the podcast, because I this is for creatives. Right? And then I had to think through that a little bit. And I thought, okay, so how do I understand this idea of what's a creative? And for me, I immediately went to poets and, people with paintbrushes and clay and, the tools of the trade. But I thought, what all those people are doing is opening possibility. Right? They're helping us to see the world in new ways. They're helping us to see ourselves in new ways. That's for me what creatives do. And I think that's what the kind of learning that I invite people into is also about. And that's what good communication is about. It's about opening possibilities, not closing them. And I think, again, that desire to be right, the desire to have the last word is always about closing. But questions and curiosity, as you say, Stephanie, is what opens. And I hope, if I could leave people with any kind of thing to play with, it would be, can you invite curiosity as a more constant companion in your communication and in your engagement with others and with the world?
But I think that you actually answered exactly why we wanted you here.
Exactly.
But Carrie, thanks so much for your time. It's been a real privilege talking to you, and also just, questioning myself, and I'm sure Alfie as well, about, how can I take this into my everyday life, and reflecting a little bit on the conversations and dialogue I've had recently and what that could look like in the future, potentially, if I take a different approach. It's been a very humbling and warm experience. So just extending a big thank you to you.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
I'm glad. And then just can you tell everyone that's listening either where they can find you, if they want to join the dialogue sessions or the leadership program, where can they reach out to you?
So probably the best is just to email me. It's Carrie, Carrie, at vuksa.com. There is a Let's Talk Dialogue Instagram page, and there's a Carrie Pratt Consulting Instagram page, but rather just email me and let's start a dialogue.
Great. We'll also post those links in the announcement post, just so everyone can copy and paste them and make sure they know where to find you.
Thank you.
And that is it, guys. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you on the next episode.